I want to kind of try and work across the two scales. One scale being the what we might think of as the kind of the pragmatics of transitioning, the pragmatics of managing change into different climates and into a kind of a post-carbon future, and all the work that's being done, particularly in the social sciences around this. For me, it's a really interesting kind of growth area of moving away from this idea of one God Almighty shift that changes the whole of society, moving towards a whole lot of kind of gradual changes and what it is that might allow those changes to take place. Very much to do with transitions that are grounded in particular cities or places or communities. The other side I'm interested in, which I guess is what I've spent most of my time kind of writing and thinking and sort of raving about, is the more vastly scaled, that again John very helpfully in his kind of Zizek quote talked about this idea of scales that vastly exceed the human. I do remember that long before Zizek was talking like that, John was talking about glacial time. I remember about sort of 15 years ago that struck me as still being quite strange for a sociologist or social theorist to be talking about these sort of stretches of time that extended far beyond the human. So I'm trying to do some kind of bridging between those two kind of temporal and spatial scales, and try and work out some ways in which those two kind of sets of stories, those two storylines might converse, might kind of tangle up and talk to each other. I think there's a kind of sense in some of the recent kind of social theory that I've been finding quite helpful, quite useful as far as doing that bridging work. There's still a kind of a sense in some of that work that it's the climate change story itself, or it's climate science, that gives you the sense of kind of vast catastrophic time that sort of interrupts local time, and that local time itself, that the local experience of nature is one of kind of gentle rhythms, it's one of familiarity, it's one of making sense of the world, and that climate change science has given us this alternative, which is this kind of catastrophic time, which kind of takes away that sense of being embedded, that sense of being able to make sense of the nature and the environment around you. I still find there's this kind of binary being set up there, that as if it's almost kind of the fault of climate change scientists to produce these kind of fractures in the everyday. And where I want to kind of make the link between the vast scale and the more everyday kind of pragmatic transitioning process is really to argue that in everyday life itself, those fractures take place long before we had a climate change story, long before there was a kind of a big climate change discourse. Really for as long as we've been human, and for a lot longer, any sort of localized living, any sort of embedding in the surrounding nature has from time to time been fractured. Our ability to make sense of the reality around us, our ability to kind of inhabit these understandable, these familiar rhythms, has from time to time been exceeded by forces that kind of overwhelm us. Whatever rhythms we've been kind of living in, sooner or later some other rhythm, some other singularity, some bigger rhythm will kind of collide and take away that sense of familiarity, remove that sense of embedding. So I guess what I'm trying to argue around is that what a lot of the science around climate change, and also around kind of earth processes more generally, is doing is it's giving us this kind of big narrative about a kind of an integrated dynamic earth, a way of sort of understanding these sort of broader rhythms. But those are not necessarily opposed or different from a lot of the kind of the everyday experience of inhabiting ecosystems or environments. Because for me, those moments of rupture, those moments of unfamiliarity, those moments when things happen that you can't make sense of, I think they really have to be as much part of the everyday as the kind of the more familiar. And this is where I find that the climate change story for me was I guess sort of going back when I first sort of came across the whole kind of climate change story in the early 80s, and I wrote a kind of a master's thesis around this, and I was thinking then that you know, climate change kind of, it changed everything in the sense that from here on in there was no aspect of the planet that we hadn't transformed, and so on. And then gradually as time went on, as the kind of the climate change, the climate science story discovered new kind of aspects of the past history of climate, and the idea of abrupt climate change kind of started to surface. Gradually I was sort of drawn into this rather different way of looking at the whole question of climate change, and really a kind of a move away from the idea that the biggest thing about the climate change story is the fact that humans have actually transformed the climate of the Earth in its totality, to the idea that the Earth's climate is much, much more kind of poised and variable and volatile than we'd ever imagined. That to me is at least as interesting and as intriguing and as scary a story as the other one about humans transforming the climate. And the idea that the only reason that we can possibly transform the climate ourselves is because it's already, in some senses, volatile and poised and you know, far from equilibrium. So in a sense, while a lot of the kind of the social science thought around climate change and around environmental change more generally has been around this whole idea of kind of human and non-human entanglement or co-production or co-implication, I've been trying to kind of hold on to the idea, and this again, you know, comes back to John's kind of use of the Zizek quote, that really perhaps a big part of the story, and perhaps even the most interesting part of the story, is what the planet is capable of doing even without us. And that sense that the climate change that we seem to have precipitated is only one episode of a whole succession of climate changes that have been going on for billions of years, and especially the last couple of 100,000 years when humans have been around has been a particularly kind of volatile period of vacillating climate. And really the idea that the Holocene, I know we're going to be talking about the Anthropocene a bit later on, but the idea that the Holocene, the last 10,000 years or so, has been a time of exceptional stability. So I think whenever we talk about the everyday, particularly as you know, social scientists, we tend to imagine an everyday which is kind of set in this happy hour of the Holocene. If we step outside the Holocene, well, the everyday is much more about quite abrupt and quite violently vacillating climate. The last 10,000 years seems to have been the most balmy and stable period for at least 400,000 years. So in many, many ways, it's been exceptional. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to hang on to the sense that a really big part of the story is about inhuman nature. And I think that in order to grasp what's sort of interesting about the Anthropocene, we have to have a pretty clear sense of what the Holocene was like and what the Pleistocene was like. And being a social scientist, those are still fairly kind of new concepts. I don't really have a strong sense of the Holocene, but I'm getting kind of more interested in it. And what if I'm interested in kind of new storylines, one of the things I think that social science has to do is to extend its own storyline out of the few hundred years of modernity, out of the kind of 10,000 odd years of the Holocene, and really kind of drag out our storylines into this glacial time, with the kind of proviso that I think glaciers have sped up since John was talking about them. Glacial time has got faster in some respects. So this kind of raises the question for me of can you hang on to this story of a kind of an inhuman nature? Can you be intrigued and curious about just what it is that the planet can do, even without our impacts, our interventions, at the same time as being extremely concerned about our impacts on climate, and also at the same time as hanging on to this much more kind of pragmatic story about how it is on the ground, in particular existing communities, tied up with all the practices that John was talking about, how behaviour change, if we want to talk about it like that, how that can take place given that we're locked into infrastructures, how to move between that kind of scale of thinking about responding to climate change and the kind of the vast, much larger than human scale. That's the question I'm sort of posing. I tried to sort of answer it on the train on the way here and scribbled down lots of notes, but there's still some kind of missing links. One of the reasons why I want to hang on to the inhumanness of Earth and cosmic processes is partly in relation to I guess it was what was captured very nicely in Phil's presentation about the you control climate change and the hands in the planets. I think as long as we keep centering climate change on human activity, we keep coming back to this kind of image of planet in our hands. And I think that's not a helpful image of what the planet does and what it's capable of doing. The sense that, and there's almost a strange kind of way that in kind of bigging up what it is we've done to the climate, we also inflate our potential to take control of the issue. So in a sense, even by telling a dismal narrative, we are in a way kind of inflating our own potential to take some sort of control over global climate. I think that there are kind of dangers to that. I guess one of the reasons why I'm interested in that long, drawn-out process, particularly the human experience of going through and going across kind of multiple tipping points in climate, that sense that going across or going through a major climatic kind of regime change is in fact, in Earth time, quite an ordinary thing to do. It's something that humans or hominids have gone through dozens and dozens of times before in the past. I just realised during Phil's presentation that I have a story of overcoming, and my story of overcoming is about how humans or hominids with a hell of a lot less resources than we have today have made it across these thresholds. So I'm trying to find ways of linking up all the other times we've crossed these kind of climatic thresholds in the past, the kind of improvisation we had to do, the various versions in various parts of the planet that different kind of human groups or our kind of distant ancestors, the various versions they had to do of improvising with the kind of the locally available materials in order to make it alive across these kind of major transitional points. And what I would like to see is, in a sense, more conversation between the kind of ground level, the kind of transition management literature, and all these other kind of transitions we've been through in the past. I think one of the places where these two sets of literatures or these two kind of styles of thinking can converse is thinking about what happens once we start to remove this kind of cushioning effect of relying on fossil fuel, which again kind of joins up kind of quite nicely with John's talk. This sense that for the last couple of hundred years, and especially for the last century, that a lot of the rhythms and variabilities of inhabiting a dynamic Earth have been kind of smoothed over by this kind of bonanza of oil that we've been able to depend upon. This kind of easy oil has helped us through diurnal rhythms, through seasonal rhythms, and through the kind of bigger interannual rhythms. So I think there's been a lot of kind of loss of knowledge or loss of understanding about the rhythms of a dynamic Earth during this phase of kind of relying on this phase of kind of subsidy by oil. So I think that one of the things that happens when you start thinking seriously about moving into kind of post-carbon futures is really a kind of re-exposure to the rhythms and the variability and the volatility that this planet is capable of. So for me, one of the interesting things about moving into a post-carbon future, about relying more on forces like wind and solar energy, tidal energy, all sorts of kind of variations of solar, is this real sense of bodily re-exposure to a dynamic Earth. A lot of talk about solar energy up until now is always sort of imagined as being this sort of quite gentle sort of energy. But if you think of what the sun is really like, it's this, this monster of energy, as Nigel or Tai would say. I mean, relying on the sun is not necessarily taking a turn into this sort of gentle, predictable kind of energy source. It's opening up the exposure of the human body and also the kind of the vulnerability of the body, reopening bodies, communities, places to various sorts of variability. And with that opening up comes, in a sense, a kind of a renewed vulnerability. And that's where I think the kind of more recent or the newer versions of the kind of the stories of overcoming might usefully kind of make sense with, make contact with the longer term stories of overcoming. The other side of that, when we think about all these kind of local experiments that are taking place, all the kind of the very sort of variations on the transition town theme, is that in a sense they are experiments. They're experiments in post-carbon futures. They're experiments in living with the effects of climate change. But if we think of them as experiments, we have to also factor in that one of the things about experiments, by definition, is that they fail. They fall short. Experiments don't always have happy endings, or they wouldn't be experiments. So one of the things that I'm interested in about the kind of the transition management literature is the possibility of falling short, the possibility of failure, the possibility of being overwhelmed, both by sort of global social economic forces, but also being overwhelmed by the kind of the dynamic processes of the earth itself. So for me, this process of kind of more localized experimentation is a story that comes with risks. It comes with this part of the whole process is this risk of falling short, of being taken by surprise, of being overwhelmed, and that for me is an integral part of losing our dependence on oil. And of course, a lot of the world obviously never had that sort of smoothing effect of heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So one of the things I want to do again with my sort of big overcoming story about how our ancestors have worked over these kind of major thresholds and have had to improvise over these major thresholds, is that all these experiments taking place will have to cope with not only their own failure, but with the failure of other communities, other cities, other places around them, both near and far. For me, coming from New Zealand, this is a very kind of live issue, because there in the Southwest Pacific, we have these appeals coming from places like Tuvalu and Kiribati saying, our islands are going to be underwater, perhaps within this century. Our islands will become unlivable. Will you give us a home? And these direct appeals to the governments of New Zealand and Australia. So this issue of how we deal with what we could call the falling short of experimental urbanism, the falling short of experiments to live with climate change, experiments that have, in a lot of cases, are being imposed on people, whether they like it or not, and often, by way of others' use of energy. But part of this process will be part of the process of transitioning will be how we cope with the appeals of others, the appeals of strangers, whose own capacity to cope with these changes is being overwhelmed. So I'm quite interested in the kind of the conversation between attempts to manage the threshold of kind of transitions from reliance on oil and transitions of climate, trying to manage that as a sort of a socio-technical process, but also trying to manage it as an ethical, political kind of process, in which a lot of the experimenting we're going to have to do, a lot of the improvising we're going to have to do, is kind of ethical improvisation. It's how we deal with failure and how we deal with failure of others, and how we deal with the appeal of others to help each other over these kind of transitions and thresholds. And I think that for me is partly where the bigger long-term story might be kind of drawn in. I think there's a lot of times when people can be going about the kind of the everyday process of trying to experiment with transitions, trying to experiment with new niches of infrastructure, trying to kind of set up new socio-technical systems where probably it's not necessary to be kind of, constantly thinking about these massive kind of temporal and spatial scales. But I think there's moments, and particularly in those kind of moments of ethical appeal, those moments of kind of encounters with others, when that long-term story and that story of overcoming, that kind of big planetary story of overcoming might actually be quite useful, might actually give that sort of extra ethical charge, in the sense that all of us alive today have this sort of immense debt to those that have come before us, just for making it across those kind of multiple climatic thresholds. And I think if we have a much stronger sense of what we owe our ancestors, and really a much stronger sense of what a kind of absolute fluke it is that we actually made it across all those abrupt kind of climate change shifts. And if we had a stronger sense of that kind of drawn out temporal kind of planetary story, that might help at certain moments provide this sort of ethical charge as we are both exposed to the effects of climate change, but also exposed to the effects of climate change on others. So I guess one of the things I'm very interested in is really just how kind of ethical political experimentation, ethical political improvisation, and socio-technical improvisation might come together. And just in a few minutes, I thought I'd just have a quick shot at some of the questions, the essay questions that were posed to us in a very in a kind of a fleeting way. I guess one of the points I want to make about publics, and I think that the whole concept of a public is an interesting one. It's really kind of come alive in the last sort of 10 years or so. This sense that the publics are not out there kind of waiting to have various issues thrust upon them. That publics come into being sort of in response to issues, and that publics and issues bring each other, in a sense, kind of bring each other into being. And I like that sense of publics constituting themselves around various sort of issues and problems. There's an interesting question for me when I think around the kind of the big Earth story, this sense of transformations and dynamics of the planet that actually kind of exceed the human measure. There's a question about how that relates to publics that I'm still very unsure of, because when publics kind of constitute themselves, when they convene around issues, they tend to convene around things about which something can be done. They tend to convene and gather around issues that are resolvable. That's almost kind of by definition the issues that publics gather around. And if we kind of follow Bruno Latour and many others and think much more about politics in terms of publics gathering around issues, there's an interesting question of what we do politically about those things that we can't make a difference. How we live with tectonic plate movement, how we live with whatever it is that the sun does, how we live with some of the more large scale kind of terrestrial and cosmic kind of cycles that we're a part of. How does politics grapple with the things that can't be done differently? I mean, in the kind of the Latourian vision, there's an awful lot of kind of reassembly, recomposing. Publics gather around human and non-human things which can be done differently, which can be rearranged, which can be recomposed. I'm interested in the question of how we do politics that takes account of the fact that sometimes we receive or inherit things that cannot necessarily be done differently. Publics tend not to, an interesting case in New Zealand, Christchurch, with all the earthquakes that have been taking place, publics tend not to gather around and confront earthquakes. They confront the way that governments or businesses, engage with earthquakes. They confront the way they get treated after an event like this. They confront the lack of preparation, but they don't. Publics tend not to assemble around the earthquake itself. The issue of living on a dynamic earth tends to me, I think, not something that a public gathers around. But there's an interesting question for me around communities and publics, because I think that communities, in a sense, do take on. Communities have to grapple with those things that can't be done differently. I'm just sort of wondering if there's what the difference is between a communal engagement with those sorts of events and what it is that a public does. I have a sense that one of the tasks of community is how to deal with the things that can't be done differently, as is one of the tasks of the community is how do you deal with people from other communities who have been overwhelmed by those things. So there's a question for me about engaging publics, which is also a question about what publics, how we define a public and how we define the sorts of issues and problems that publics gather around. And just this question about what is a public issue and what is a community issue. And I'm still kind of playing around with that one. I'm not quite sure how to work with that. But one of the things that interests me about when we're talking about the sorts of issues that bring publics into being, they tend to be a certain sort of issue. And in the kind of the Turian view, or in Nortje Maris's work, they're quite explicitly kind of socio-technical issues. They're issues about worlds that we help bring into being. They're not issues about things which we can only have negligible impact on. So I'm interested in that question of how we engage publics around the things that are not easily or perhaps not at all able to be done differently. Because for me that is also a kind of a political, ethical problem. It's almost been something that as critical social scientists, we almost haven't been allowed to speak of things which can't be done differently. That's I guess almost the kind of for me the kind of the repressed of social science. Is that about full time?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll round it there. Thanks.